Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. Okay, welcome. We have Zac Chapman here with us today, who is with the New Economy Coalition. I have been following NEC or New Economy Coalition for quite some time. They do some really incredible work. And I'm so thrilled to have Zac here to share a little bit more. Today, we'll be diving deeper into what is the solidarity economy? What does that look like in practice? But Zac, as you may know, generally I like to start the conversation with guests sharing their own money story. So you can share as much or as little as you'd like, but to really get us started, I'd love to invite you to share your money story with listeners.
Thanks so much, Jordan, and thanks for having me on and for the work you do. I like to start sharing my money story with where my parents come from. So my mother comes from a immigrant family. She arrived here from Germany when she was around 7 years old, and was a part of what I would categorize as a working class, poor working class family in Philadelphia. Her family was able to, over the course of decades, assimilate into US whiteness, and eventually open up a meat market and gas station in outside of Philly in the Poconos and more rural region. And I would sort of define their class trajectory as one of like becoming squarely middle class. And my father comes from a wealthy insurance family in the Cleveland area. It comes from lots of intergenerational wealth. And so my parents met in New York City in the 80s and had my sister and I and raised us in the suburbs of New Jersey. And I was often, I'd say my class awareness as a kid living in a predominantly but not entirely white community in the suburbs in Jersey. It was one in which I had a lot of cross-class friendships, multiracial friendships in the area that I lived in, and went to a pretty class and racial diverse elementary, middle, and high school. And so I had this, the falsity of being middle class. And I would say that, how I define my upbringing in reality is being of the PMC, the professional managerial class. I didn't have to worry about debt for college because it was paid for on my father's side. That's where I would start of kind of where I come from. I got engaged in some campus organizing at the liberal arts college that I went to in Southern Colorado, a school called Colorado College, in the late aughts, and was mostly oriented around food systems organizing, and ended up living in Colorado Springs, the city that I lived in for like the first decade of my adult life, doing food systems organizing out there with an organization called Food to Power. It started off as a grassroots food reclamation project, and over a 6-year organizing arc became a cross-class, multiracial food justice, solidarity economy organization that was anchored in 3.5 acres of land that was redistributed, upon which we built a Black-led food hub and an Indigenous-led healing garden. We started a composting initiative, and a handful of other things as well. And it was through that organizing arc that I think I really did become more clear around class and how it shows up in organizing. And this is around the time, I'd say, so this is around 2015 through 2018, That's where I really became aware of the work of resource generation. And by 2020, I went through a praxis that I co-organized with a handful of alumni and current students at the school that I went to at Colorado College. And so we all did praxis together. And that really clarified my own commitments around the full redistribution of my inheritance. And it also really clarified the work that I see that I have to do in this movement, which is work of wealth redistribution, work of supporting the resourcing of our movements. And so I think that's where I'll stop for now. And yeah, I really appreciate this as an overarching framing of a question, because I wish it would be the one-on-one that so many folks have in organizing spaces, both publicly and not.
Truly. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I also, like, I didn't know that you co-organized your own praxis. And it sounds like it was a little bit of intergenerational potentially too, at the college. That's really cool. Before we get into just talking about the solidarity economy in general, I think what you just left us on, like, clarified the work that you're here to do. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But can you just share a little bit more about that? Like, how maybe that realization, or just like, what does that mean to you as someone who comes from having access to wealth and class privilege?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a tricky line because I think that they're, while well-intentioned, an orientation of like, oh, because I come from class privilege, I should be in development-related spaces, can have this knock-on effect of, um, oh, all the people who are doing development are PMC, which is a real thing, which is a real trend, and yeah, the distinction between PMC and owning class folks, but there's a lot of PMC organizers, and I think that that's something that is a constant thing to contend with and talk through together. But I also see there really being a mandate from in my life personally of leveraging, whether it be at the volunteer level, at my familial level, and in the workplace, that those manifold forms of access, privilege that I have. And then I think there's another layer to this too, which is that I am just insatiably curious about how social movements, leftist social movements, progressive social movements are resourced, have been resourced, can be resourced. And the flip side of that is I really spend a lot of time researching how the right does that and how successful the right has been at um, mobilizing resources, organizing money, etc. And so there is this kind of like two sides to that as well.
I'm gonna hold that in case we come back to it, but amazing. Thank you. And I really appreciate the like nuance and kind of the contradiction that you're naming of like the positionality that we hold and also like what that means for the work that we need to organize our people around. So thank you. So, Zac, you have been involved in a lot of solidarity economy infrastructure building, kind of painting a narrative and a picture of what that looks like, but also displaying examples of what does that actually look like in practice, which I think has been so supportive. And listeners of this show have probably heard me talk about the solidarity economy often, but not actually clarify like what is that? What does that look like within late stage capitalism? So today I'm really hoping we can do a deeper dive into that. So can you share 101 level, like what actually is the solidarity economy? And then any examples that come to mind that you want to highlight?
Okay, I'm very excited for this. So I think that one of the things that can make defining the solidarity economy hard is that it can mean various things. So I want to anchor it in three different things: a solidarity economy movement, solidarity economy principles, and solidarity economy practices. And so just moving through each of those. So the solidarity economy movement is this global social movement to build an economy where, broadly speaking, we are democratizing all the manifold aspects of our society and economy. So we are democratizing our workplaces. We are democratizing finance. We are democratizing land and housing. We are democratizing the economy. And that's why, there's a lot of, this is sort of an umbrella term, you'll often hear terms like participatory democracy or economic democracy. These are kind of within this broader tent of this movement that really grew out of Latin America and the global South, to build out a society in which the community needs are governed by everyday people. And so I would say that it's also rooted in these principles, right? It's rooted in principles of responsive and participatory governance. It's rooted in principles of frontline leadership. It's rooted in principles of cultures of reparations, of rematriation, et cetera. And so those are the sort of some of the principles that anchor this work of building deep democracy. And then with that, what follows is, okay, well, that sounds great overarchingly. How do you actually do it? And that's where the actual practices come in. Very explicit practices and institutions that provide real alternatives to racial capitalism. And so some of these practices, can include in the realm of finance, which you are very, very embedded in, Jordan, is, non-extractive loan firms, public banking, radical financial advisors, or SUSUs, which are informal loan clubs. At the realm of land and housing, it can include community land trusts or permanent real estate cooperatives. These are very specific legal structures that work to decommodify land and housing. Agrarian trusts are another example of that too. And in the realm of governance, we have people's movement assemblies, we have participatory budgeting, universal basic income. And at the realm of consumption, we have electric cooperatives. Many folks don't know that over 35% of the energy in the US is mediated through these rural electric cooperatives that were established during the New Deal era. And unfortunately, a lot of them have become very anti-democratic, very beholden to the fossil fuel industry. And there's a whole movement that was actually, there's a spin-off coalition that came out of New Economy Coalition called the Rural Power Coalition that's working to create a just transition for rural electric cooperatives. So I use these as a handful of examples at all the different aspects of the societal level to really share how the solidarity economy looks very, very specifically. And I think that sometimes there is this kind of interesting tension in which solidarity economy is both so wide and expansive of an umbrella, and yet it's also so hyper specific of all these different practices and institutions that I was mentioning, that it can be kind of hard to almost find that middle ground definition that's really concise and easy for folks to get across. And I actually do think that has been a sort of a narrative issue with the movement itself. But that's what I would say. So it's a movement, it's a set of principles, it's a set of practices and institutions.
I love how you laid that out so clearly. And some of the examples that Zac just shared, like permanent real estate cooperatives. We just did an episode with East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperatives. You can go listen to that episode afterwards, learn more. And I just thank you for naming all of those incredible examples. And you touched on this already a little bit, but can you just share how the solidarity economy fits into just the just transition theory of change? And maybe within that, like, what could accountability or what does accountability to a just transition look like within a solidarity economy?
No, I love that. Yeah. So if we're using the just transition framework, very specifically that movement generation, which is often how it's defined. I know that there's a broader definition of just transition that folks use, in a much more overarching way of like, oh, we need to, have a just transition for rural coal workers in Appalachia into like different workplaces. But if we're being really, really specific about movement generations framework of moving from an extractive economy into what they call a living or regenerative economy, how we often refer to it at NEC is that's a bridge, right? So there's a bridge that needs to be done of moving from an extractive economy into a regenerative economy. And NEC's work that we organize alongside our 170 members across the US and US territories is that second half of the bridge. Another way that folks have referred to the shorthand of the bridge is there's the resist side and then there's the build side, right? We need to resist this extractive racial capitalist economy that is built off of stolen land, labor, livelihood, built off of the enclosure of land and resources. And we need to build a new economy that values true cooperation, deep democracy, et cetera. And so how the solidarity economy could be framed is it's that second half of the bridge. It's the build work. It's the very specific spade work of creating, democratized land through, as you mentioned, the work that E.B. Preck is doing in the Bay. It's the very specific work of building worker cooperatives and union cooperatives to democratize labor. And so that's how we often articulate it is in the just transition, it's the question of what are we transitioning to? We can't just have a political articulation that's defined in the negative. It has to be rooted in a positive project, a very specific project of creating a new economy. And so that's how I overarchingly would describe just transition and as it relates to the solidarity economy.
Yes, there's so many different pieces that can fit into it as well. And before I move into the next question I want to ask you, I also just wanted to lift up, and I think this was a project that NEC sponsored, but feel free to correct me, Zach. But there's a book that came out called Beautiful Solutions. And that book, wow, when I read it, I was like, there are so many incredible examples across the world, not just in the, Turtle Islands, so-called United States. So if you find yourself being curious around, hey, what does this look like in practice? What types of sectors or industries can this touch? Spoiler alert, it's basically all of them. But go check that book out. I'll put it in the show notes as well. Zach, anything that you want to also please correct me if
Yeah,
I'm
no, we did. Yeah, it was a project that was fiscally sponsored by NEC and was built over the course of many, many years of the wisdom of a handful of former NEC staff, including Eli Fagali and Rachel Plattis, and very principally the work of movement ancestry, Landria Williams, who is an incredible, powerful Southern Solidarity Economy organizer, researcher, incredible human. And so that was a project that was built over so many years. And yeah, Jordan, I have that book right on my shelf over here as well. And I could not recommend it
too.
enough. Sometimes when I'm feeling really low in the morning after reading the news, I'll just like flip it open and just read a story about, a radical solution that has happened in the past or a tool for us to really anchor in. And so couldn't recommend it enough either.
Absolutely. And so I'm curious, in that spirit, and as the solidarity economy continues to be built, and also acknowledging elements of it have been here for millennia. So there's like a both and there. But it's also, to me, I see it as being very critical to movement infrastructure. What are we moving towards? And so when you think about like scalability, which I don't love that word, because it makes me think of a very particular like scaling up. But when we think about solidarity economy growing horizontally, becoming more established, becoming more rooted, what type of infrastructure do you see as being like really needed and core to supporting the solidarity economy growth?
One of the ways that I really like to hone this specific topic of what's the infrastructure that's needed is based on the writings of an individual named Mike Menser, who writes a lot about the elements of what he refers to as participatory democracy. But again, this big tent that we're in, right? And he articulates four things that you need to build the solidarity economy, economic democracy, et cetera. You need some sort of financing entity or entities, banks, et cetera. You need a university and or research arm. You need some kind of coordinating entity, and you need a strong social movement base, right? So it's like you need the funds, you need the research, you need the coordination, and you need a social movement. And so I overarchingly would agree with those four main things. And I think, again, we also need shared principles and alignment around the principles of what actually is a solidarity economy as well. But just to walk through those a little bit. So starting off with a bank refinancing entity, if you are really seeking to shift how our economy functions, there's no pathway through that doesn't involve some sort of interface with finance. And this is, I think, this broad bucket we could really define as the work of movement finance, and the work, whether it be the work of social movement investing, but also the work, and this is to use the sort of movement generation, just transition frame, also changing the rules of how finance capitalism functions as well, right? This is not just an outside strategy. I think that is a misconception about the solidarity economy movement. This is also about regulating and really honing in the power of capital. But we need movement accountable, movement driven financing institutions as well, right? And so that's often, that can look like amenable credit unions and public banking as well, but it can also look like this massive proliferation of non-extractive lending vehicles that we've seen arise specifically in the US over the past 5-10 years, to support the creation of all these entities, institutions that we were just talking about, right? Like decommodifying lands, and building, permanently affordable, democratized social housing on that land takes resources, right? And so we need financing institutions that are amenable to that. The second thing around research in university is that when you look at areas, whether it be across the US or outside the US, that have strong regionalized social solidarity economy ecosystems of activity, there is very often some semblance of a university or education or research component to it. Based where I am here in Western Massachusetts, there is, in the context of the US, a rather strong solidarity economy movement out here of interwoven web of decommodified land and housing, worker cooperatives, et cetera. It's still very small compared to many other ecosystems outside of the US, but it's strong relative to other regions. And one of the real reasons why is because the University of Massachusetts Amherst is one of only a handful of heterodox economic departments in the US and has a lot of professors, or a handful of professors, who are really honed in on training up these university students on how they can really actualize solidarity economy principles and practices. So that's just to use one example. And then regarding a coordinating entity, Mike Mentzer refers to it as a non-governmental coordinating entity. I would say it doesn't have to be non-governmental. I think that there are a lot of examples like the Chantier, which is a network mediated through the state in Quebec that supports and incubates the solidarity economy out there. But in the US, for example, the work of New Economy Coalition, we support the infrastructure of our 170 members through providing trainings, through providing convenings, through providing working groups that seed new policy platforms or new democratically governed funds. It's really important to have that kind of coordinating infrastructural support as well. And then the fourth and final thing that he mentions, right, is this multi-issue social movement base. And I would say that that's that resource that we don't talk about enough when we're talking about how to resource the solidarity economy movement. Is you need that people power. You need coordinated, principled people power to build out these entities, to demand that local municipalities enact things like people's assemblies or enact participatory budgeting, et cetera. So those, I'd say, are a lot of the elements that I would see as being really needed to grow and scale the work of the solidarity economy movement.
Wow, it really just connected this major dot for as someone who lives in Texas, where I feel like the solidarity economy infrastructure here is like I look at Massachusetts and the Northeast and the West Coast, and I'm just like, what? It's like so much stronger over there. And it feels kind of like a much newer concept. Or sometimes like I'm the most radical finance person in the room a lot of the times. So connecting it to the academia was just kind of like blew my mind a little bit as you were talking. So thank you. Um, and you mentioned those kind of three pieces, and I'm curious to connect that with some of the myths or misconceptions about the solidarity economy. I think there's different assumptions, different, you know, even like conflict amongst groups that can come up. I think that's true of any dynamic. But any
Mhm.
myths about the solidarity economy that you want to bust a little bit?
Yeah, I feel like the number one myth that I want to bust about the solidarity economy movement is that it's all about small interventions, like planting a community garden, and is not serious about contending for power. Like I'm remembering this quote from a book that I read years ago that was something to the effect of JPMorgan doesn't care if you raise chickens, right? And I think that quote has always stuck with me. I need to track down who the actual person was that said that. But I think that there's this powerful truth in that, right? Is like um if you're just seeking to opt out of capitalism, the nefarious, all-consuming powers of it will continue to just keep expanding. And so on principle, I agree with this idea of like if we're not serious about contending for power, it is true. JP Morgan doesn't care about a food co-op. They don't care about your community garden. Um, but when we look at on a global level what this movement represents and in so many different multifarious ways what it has materially built, it is not about just small non-power building interventions. In the Emilia Romagna region of Italy, where 4.5 million people are based in this region in Bologna, has one of the densest cooperative economies in the world. 2 out of every 3 inhabitants in this region are co-op members, and cooperative labor produces more than a third of the region's GDP. In the Rojava autonomous region of Syria, there are millions of people participating in feminist people's assemblies um, that are building all like in literally in the midst of civil war and various forms of occupation. They are building a cooperative economy. The Zapatistas building cooperative indigenous economies in their region. And in 1994, upon these horrid free trade agreements being unleashed, occupying their capital, um, that's power building. What's happening in Rojava is power building. When I see what's happening with cooperative organizers in New York City now having seats at the table in the Mamdani administration, that's power building. And so I would bust the myth that the um, solidarity economy movement is really about just small interventions. Um, is my main gripe as well. And I think there's one other piece of this that I wanted to share too, because of a lot of the work that I do is around resourcing, is that I think that there can be, even though I made all these statements about the importance of um, wielding governing power, I also think that if we're limiting the funding ecosystem to policy and electoral wins, and not talking about the importance of prefigurative power building, there can be a big issue there as well. So just to anchor this in a very specific example, right? So creating housing justice isn't just going to come from passing, TOPA, which is tenant opportunity to purchase laws, which allows tenants the first right of refusal to buy out their um, their housing from their landlord, or electing more folks into office who are more amenable to um, to renters' rights. Housing justice is also going to derive from resourcing the tenants' rights groups, the folks who are experimenting with these new institutions of community land trusts, of permanent real estate cooperatives. These are the things that make fighting for TOPA worthwhile, right? So we need to really, I think, look at the ways in which, when we're talking about funding, how, yes, we need to be trying to really wield governing power through things like rent control, through TOPA, et cetera. Like, I'm literally out here doing field canvassing on my volunteer time. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is going to pass rent control in November. I'm all here for it. And it's not enough to just pass these state level initiatives. We need to really invest in the ecosystems of activity, the social movement, and the very specific technical assistance and resources, whether it be, lawyers who are really, really excited and creative about building new legal structures, like the folks at Sustainable Economies Law Center and Movement Law Lab. And it's also going to involve needing to really resource folks who are building land trusts, real estate cooperatives, et cetera.
Yes. Like so many plus ones to that. Thank you for sharing those. It's bringing up kind of like two thoughts for myself, which like one of them, it makes me think about like what traditional finance might call like diversification. But I think we really need to have diversification in our strategies and how we resource those strategies. It's not just going to be like one solution to pave the way. It's going to take coordinated strategic alignment across many solutions. So I really appreciate you naming that, because it is very much like a braid and less of just like one path. And the other thing, just to touch on the like power building that you mentioned, it also makes me think of, and I apologize because I can't remember exactly the language that was used, but how New Economy Coalition has been talking about the like within, outside, and against strategies, and how it actually takes all of those. So I'm just wondering if you could speak. I don't even think I'm using the right words, but could you speak to that a little bit more, of like how that power building can come to be?
Definitely. Yeah. So this is something that came out of in 2024, NEC launched this free resource. It's still free and accessible and updated weekly, of a solidarity economy funding library that includes hundreds of movement-aligned fiscal sponsors, non-extractive investors, funders, et cetera, in the solidarity economy movement. And we did this really wonderful webinar launch in which my dear comrade Nairuti Shastri, who now works for Center for Economic Democracy, and myself worked on this articulation that we then later published in the Forge Organizing Journal, around basically an overarching call to align strategies that are working within, without, and against philanthropy. And the within, without, against framing came ourselves from this really incredible grassroots organization, Mi Gente, who had advocated a political framework that advocated for working within, without, and against the state to achieve its political goals. And so I'd say that, the overarching idea, right, is that, and this is really comes from kind of just a sober assessment of the multi-tendencies within the solidarity economy movement, right? Like it includes folks who are coming from more of a progressive and or socialist orientation when it comes to state power. It includes folks who are coming from a more anarchist, anti-state lineage. It includes folks who are coming from indigenous ontologies and ways of engaging with the notion of a state, and folks from the Black radical tradition. And so it really includes a lot of different folks and with a lot of different orientations around how we govern money, how we engage with the state, et cetera. And the contention specifically that Nairuti and I were making in terms of philanthropy, and it's really interesting to think about this, about 2 years later from us having published the article, but is that in this specific political moment, being awash with resourcing strategies that include, dues-based labor organizing, increased mutual aid activity, funder organizing, or alongside frontline groups. It really needs and calls for us to align our strategies. And what that means is not necessarily saying like, okay, everyone needs to get on the philanthropy bandwagon. Like, no, it actually is good, especially when we look at this current political moment we're in 2 years after writing this article, of historic contraction of philanthropy, of generationally historic state repression emerging on certain legal entities that chose to do a 501c3 structure rather than maybe chose to remain unincorporated. We're stronger with a wide ecosystem of different legal structures, different ways of engaging with the state, different ways of engaging with philanthropy. But the question is, how do we work in coalition with one another? How do we work in collaboration with one another? And I think there's a couple really heartening examples that I've found, right, of seeing the ways in which solidarity between organized labor and worker cooperatives have been engaging. The U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives has been doing some really incredible work alongside organized labor, building out union cooperatives, learning the ways that the governance structures of these respective movements can support and flank one another. I also think about cross-coalitional tables like Rising Majority, which is a space in which many, many different groups across what we loosely call the social movement left, which can include organized labor, it can include political parties, it includes base building groups, it includes mutual aid groups and solidarity economy groups. We come together, we struggle, we work on strategies together, we work on narrative lines together, we work on ways to resource together. And so I think that there needs to be more of that alignment that's rooted not just in sharing ideas, but also kind of really working on strategy together. That this moment in particular, even much more than 2 years ago, is really, really needed.
Amazing segue into my final question for you. And maybe it's very much related to what you just shared, and I just appreciate like the tangible examples. Just thank you. That is so helpful to be able to reference things that are in motion and happening. And I'm curious to hear like what compelling opportunities, like if we do take like a pretty sober assessment of, the state of the movement, the state of the solidarity economy and what we're trying to build and resource, what compelling opportunities do you see for resourcing solidarity economy work? And I'm not to like put too much into this question, but I'm curious from the stance of like where it's already like in Massachusetts and the Northeast, where it's already has stronger development, and maybe in a place where there's a lot of room to really get started. So curious to
Yeah.
hear what musings you have on that.
Yeah. I love this question. I'm again really holding this specific political moment we're in right now, in which we're seeing, again, just such a serious contraction of the kinds of support and resources that we were seeing, I'd say, in this movement between, like loosely 2018 through last year. We're seeing a lot of funders shifting their course, pre-complying with atrocious repressive strategies of the state. I think, though, in the same moment, there are a lot of unique opportunities, specifically around resourcing, that this moment holds. Overarchingly, democratically governed funds, whether they be non-extractive loan funds or more participatory philanthropic vehicles, are still growing and are such an incredible resource that has very much opened up in the last 5 to 10 years. When I see what the work of Shared Capital Cooperative, Seed Commons, these are cooperative movement anchored loan funds. When I see how much they've grown in such a short period of time, I see such opportunity for that. Similarly to the growth of democratically governed philanthropic funds, gotta plug New Economy Coalition here in 2020, a group of Black NEC staff and members came together to create a working group that would seed what is now called the Black Solidarity Economy Fund, which has been around for 5 years now, has democratically redistributed over $1 million to Black Solidarity Economy organizers across the US and beyond. And it's also served as an incredible base building tool for us to bring in new members into our coalition. And it's really been incredible to see the ways in which this impact has gone so far beyond just a notion of understanding resourcing through money, but money can also really be a governance tool. And I think that the growth of these kinds of funds, whether they be philanthropically, democratically governed, or offering non-extractive loans, is not a small thing, is something we need to keep on resourcing and building. And a second thing I would say is, I think, broadening the definition of resourcing beyond just finance, money, etc. As this has been a kind of recurrent thread throughout this conversation, is the need of really engaging people power to build democratic systems of care and support, and specifically on the regional level. I would urge anyone who's listening to this to think about your specific region, like your specific economy, mapping out where are the opportunities for bringing in more democratic, participatory self-governance to the community you live in, whether it's a very small town or a large city. And there's, on NEC's website, there's a full map that it also includes all of our members and where they're located. And then I think there's a third thing that's coming to mind to me that's kind of more of a wonky thing, but it feels especially prescient given some news that happened just this past week of seeing how the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the largest civil rights organizations in the US, is under investigation by the Trump administration, and seeing, without any legal need for it, the pre-compliance of Fidelity Charitable and a handful of other large donor advised funds ceasing the ability for their fund holders to make donations to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And, DAFs, donor advised funds, have been on my mind, and I think on a lot of our minds for a while. They are the fastest growing form of philanthropy. There were, just with Fidelity itself, I believe, I wrote this down. Yeah, 400,000 people made grants through Fidelity last year. 400,000 people. David Callahan, who is the editor of Inside Philanthropy, has had some really incredible writing on this that has kind of shifted my perspective, in which he talks about, the common criticisms of DAFs are, you can get the immediate tax benefit, you can just warehouse money, there's, a lot more opaqueness, less transparency around who's giving. These are all very real criticisms and concerns. But what he writes about is that there's this other story, which is about the decentralization of philanthropic power. So like decades ago, foundations, institutional foundations, were far more the main actors in not only moving money, but creating a narrative around what is funded. And now increasingly we have this bizarre scenario where there's a shift in which the mass amounts of philanthropic donations that are being made are through these very often unorganized, decentralized donor advised funds. And I think that there's, what this to me says is like, okay, again, obviously, sure, abolish DAFs. I want that. Let's keep fighting for stuff like that. It also is not enough to just have that articulation. I think it's great that there are movement anchored DAFs that exist out there. There are some incredible examples. If anyone listening to this has a donor advised fund through Schwab or Fidelity, see what you can do to move it to a different location, a different banking institution that's actual in alignment with movements. And so there's the threat of all the things I just mentioned, but I really see that there's an opportunity to organize on a more comprehensive level radical financial advisors, radical donor advisors. I know you're very much engaged in this work, Jordan, in varying ways. And I think that's a nut that I haven't really fully cracked or understood. But it's something that I think we need to get a lot more serious about. Because if these large banking institutions can, at the drop of a hat, make decisions about where we can or can't move money, that portends so much badness for our movement and for the state of democracy on the whole. So I think there's a threat there, but I'm very much curious about not only what donor advised funds can do when they're in alignment with movement, but how the question of how to organize this decentralized network of donor advisors. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, I would love to hear your
Oh my
thoughts
gosh,
on that
I
in
am
particular.
like so glad you brought up DApps. Because it's something, you know, in my other hat that I wear as a financial advisor at Oberon Capital Advisors, we recommend DApps. Some of our integrated capital where we're doing non-extractive loans paired with a grant, could be a 10% grant, 20%, even 30%, or whatever is supportive. A lot of that comes through DApps because you can transfer, this is getting real technical, but you can transfer appreciated assets in kind, meaning that there's more that can go to the like philanthropic giving as opposed to having to sell it and pay capital gains taxes. So there's like a tax justice lens, which you already kind of named. But yes, like what would it look like? And I think like half my DAF is a campaign where I'm seeing a little bit of like organizing around, but like what would it look like if everyone had a pledge or like a commitment, a like true commitment to move X amount of dollars beyond the 5% minimum every year? And how can DAFs, you know, incorporate that into their own structure? Like I think Possibility Labs, I'm blanking on the actual I want to say it's like 20%, 15 or 20% needs to be moved out. It might be even a little higher. But that's one that I'm seeing like being more accountable and really rigorous in how they're aligning with movement. Or what if everyone had the same type of like same organization we were going to fund within like 100 people that had DApps? Like how can we coordinate the giving strategy or the philanthropic gifts in a coordinated strategic way? But I think also like we just signed on to the letter challenging, because you're totally right, it was Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, maybe another one, maybe a couple more, about the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's ridiculous. There's no reason that they had to make this choice. They're complying in advance and withholding their power. And so as advisors, how can we be more coordinated to say, no, this isn't right. I'm not just going to comply with decisions from these institutions, but we're going to challenge it and contest it, and like challenge those capital forces. And so I really see a big need. Like if you're a radical financial professional listening in, I really see a need to collectively organize our strategies, whether it's contesting, whether it's strategic divestment, whether it's sharing diligence for these non-extractive loan funds so that we can resource those more strategically in a more coordinated way. So I feel like I maybe got a little bit on my soapbox there, but
no, I so appreciate that. I so appreciate that.
yeah. And I think just something else that I'll name about DAFs for listeners, and then we'll move into the wrap up. There are DAFs that exist where you can do recoverable grants. So think of that as kind of like a middle area between non-repayable capital and a non-extractive loan. Like a recoverable grant is really shifting the power dynamic, but is intended to be repaid. It's not always a fit for every project, but sometimes it is. So there's DAFs that you can make recoverable grants from, that can really support the capital stack, especially for cooperative housing, like these big land-backed projects or housing justice projects, or, you know, worker cooperatives, any type of big democratically governed organization that will need significant types of financing, and that can support their capital stack. And as well as like making gifts to individuals that are not just C3s. There's some DAFs that exist for that too. So it's been cool, even like within without, sorry, I keep getting the words mixed up in my head, but those strategies within, without, yes,
Yeah.
within, without, against. Thank you. Like even that can like come into play within DApps as like a little microcosm of that. So
Yes,
thank
exactly.
you.
That's what I love about that framing, is that it opens up a question not only of yes, no, but yes, no, how, um, for so many different forms of how we strategize.
Yes, I love it. Oh, I'm like getting so much energy from this conversation. So thanks. But with the time we have left, so Zac, we covered so much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, the wisdom of New Economy Coalition, the wisdom of movement elders that have informed your perspective. So before we wrap up, just anything else that you want to make space for, or to phrase it another way, if you had a magic wand, what do you wish listeners of the show already knew about?
Okay, my little magic wand is, because I didn't talk so much about the particulars of NEC, I got to give the shout out. And the magic wand is, I wish everyone knew about our resource list of Solidarity Economy 101 that's on our website, that includes so many different avenues of engaging with the Solidarity Economy movements, from trainings to courses to frameworks to all the different incredible work that our members are building. So I would ask folks to check that out, and also ask folks with wealth, access, and resources to consider making a donation to our Black Solidarity Economy Fund. 100% of the resources go directly to incredible, rad Black Solidarity Economy organizers across the US. So those are my two little asks / wand waves to close out this conversation. And thank you so much for having me on, Jordan. It was really, really a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, I feel exactly the same. And thank you. I'll be linking in the show notes to the Black Solidarity Economy Fund. And yes, resourcing NEC is one way to resource the solidarity economy. So thank you, Zac. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.